ADOC I'm a founding member of ADOC. It was birthed by Leo Chang and Grace Lee, who are here, but it's really been grown to a national network of several hundred Asian American documentary filmmakers. It's been growing all year. And we, sorry, my computer's falling. We got together partly as a response and to engage in the conversation around Doc So White. We also want to pass on resources and knowledge from generation to generation and raise the visibility of Asian American documentary filmmakers. We had a sense that in a way we were reaching a glass ceiling and we wanted to smash that glass ceiling. So this is our New York debut with this panel. And very consciously the panel is a cross-racial panel. We don't see our work as only limited to Asian Americans and only limited to race. Power and perspective. We came upon that title for very specific reasons because of the inherent politics in the documentary. We believe that image not only matters on screen, but the production process behind screen and who gets to tell that story and how that film gets made. It matters not only because of race, I think we've gone beyond that, but recognizing people have multiple identities of sexuality, gender, class, nationality, and citizenship. So this is something we've been talking for a long time. I've been in the business for over 35 years. When I started in the 1980s, we really mostly talked in terms of the way people were being stratified by race within the documentary field. And I've been in many of these panels, and we always start in the past few years by saying, this is not a bitch fest. We really want to get beyond that and figure out, and to steal a word or a phrase from Edwin Martinez, to figure out the DNA of the documentary, how to decolonize the documentary. What is it that reproduces racial and stratification, reproduces stratification of gender and sexuality and class, and how do we resist that stratification? So this is what we've got, a panel of world-class filmmakers who are going to talk about working as insiders in their own communities as documentary filmmakers, also as outsiders, working in communities and cultures that are not their own. And so what we're going to do is I'll introduce each panelist, we'll show a clip of their work, and then we're just really going to mix it up and we're going to attack this question of power and perspective in documentary storytelling. So the first is Geeta Gandbhir. I hope I pronounced your name okay.
That was pretty good.
Oh, thank you.
It's
okay.
close.
I hate it when they do that. Geeta's won 2 Emmy Awards as a director and producer, and films that she has edited have won an Academy Award and 4 Peabodys. She co-directed the feature documentary Armed with Faith, which is playing tomorrow here at Doc NYC, about a bomb disposal unit in Pakistan. Her other directing credits include HBO's I Am Evidence and A Journey of 1,000 Miles, Peacekeepers. And we're going to show a clip from Geeta's film. Thank you. Okay. Nadia Hallgren is an award-winning filmmaker and director of photography from the Bronx, and her work focuses on verite storytelling. Nadia's cinematography credits include the Sundance Award-winning Motherland, which also premiered at the Berlin Film Festival, and she just flew back actually from a Motherland screening in Los Angeles. Motherland was filmed in the Philippines at the world's busiest maternity ward, and apart from Motherland, she's shot Trapped, Don Potter's Trapped, Untouchable, War, Don Don, and many other films. And Nadia also has a clip to show from Motherland. Thank you. Thank you. Our next filmmaker is Steve Maing. I'm terrible. I can't even pronounce my own people's names. Steve is a Brooklyn-based filmmaker and visual journalist. His feature documentary, High Tech Low Life, about two of China's first dissident citizen journalists, aired nationally on POV. His short film, The Surrender, was nominated for an Emmy, and he's currently completing the feature documentary, Crime and Punishment. Steve is a fellow of the Sundance Institute's documentary film program, and I think you're going to show a clip from Crime and Punishment, which is a work in progress.
That's right.
Thank you. And Edwin Martinez, also a Bronx-born filmmaker whose directorial debut, To Be Heard, about three Bronx teenagers, won the Metropolitan and Audience Awards here at Doc NYC. He's now completing Personal Statement, an IFP Doc Lab project, which is slated for a festival run next year. Edwin is an assistant professor of film in the SUNY Purchase Film Conservatory, and he wrote a seminal essay, Navigating the River, The Hidden Colonialism of Documentary, in Documentary Magazine, which a lot of people are still talking about. So thanks to all of our panelists for making it out here in this cold. I'm from LA, it's really freezing outside, but nice and warm in here, and it's going to get hot in a minute, so we're really going to, as I said, mix it up on this discussion. I just wanted to open up. Let's start. We're talking about both working as insiders and outsiders. Let's start from the insider's perspective. For a long time, filmmakers of color have argued that we have the right to tell our own story, and there's a kind of a politics in terms of building our communities and building our cultures that's connected to having control over our own story. Can you talk about your own work? Because all of you have done work from both sides of the lens as insiders and outsiders. So can you talk about working within your own community and why it mattered that you were an insider? What difference did it make? Steve, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, in the most obvious way, there's a lot of shorthand that comes with working on a story in a community that you can relate to on a very deep level. I did a piece about a State Department analyst that was being tried under the Espionage Act, and he was a Korean American just like me. It turned out, in a very weird matter of chance that we had both our families had moved to the Bronx in the same housing complex, and we just were like in adjacent buildings, and so that was an example of how there was just so much to talk about, and the connection was so immediate. And he was about 7 years my senior, and so he treated me like a little brother, and that's a very specific kind of Korean dynamic. So I think that access is wonderful when you have that familiarity.
Nadia?
I've had many different experiences, especially as a cinematographer and recently as a director, filming with folks that sort of sometimes agree to be filmed but are hesitant or aren't quite sure what that means at the end of the day. And oftentimes when I show up, they're very happy to see another person of color, to see a woman, to see the person that is going to be spending time in their home is someone that potentially understands them on another level. If the person may live in poverty, that there's a level of shame in their home, and then if, having someone there that they don't feel is scrutinizing them or sort of comes from the same place. I feel like they're a level of calm kind of comes over them, and then we can relate again on, different life experiences in order to build an initial relationship. I think that could be really helpful.
Geeta?
It's interesting. I would say for me, I have similar experiences. Obviously, I've worked within the South Asian. I've made films about the South Asian community, and but it's interesting within that. There's still a level of separation in that. My last two films were about women and now men from a Muslim community, and I am not Muslim. And I think one of the really important things that I have found is, particularly if you are directing or producing, is to make sure that your team is, and if you have obviously the power to bring on people, is that your team you have to have partnership with people from the community and other filmmakers who are from the community. For instance, my the film prior to this one was about the Bangladeshi community and, women who were Muslim, and Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy was my co-director, and that was very purposeful. It was a film that I wanted to make, but I felt that, again, there had to be an equal partner on board who could again, bring us to a deeper level of understanding within that specific community. And on this film, my co-director, Asad Faruqi, is Pakistani and from Karachi. Sharmeen was a producer. One of our DPs is sitting right here in the front row, Nashin Dadaboy, who was also on the ground. She is Pakistani. It was critical, again, to have that sort of alliance with people from the community. So I think I agree that obviously just being South Asian gave me some access that I wouldn't have had otherwise, but I still felt like the onus was on me, again, to build out a team that was even more reflective of the community that I was dealing with.
Eddie?
There's a perk to going last, but also your thoughts get more complex when you hear everyone else's perspectives. The film, my first film, To Be Heard, I don't think could be much more of an insider film. It was about these three teenagers who met in this high school. The high school is a school that my mom taught at, which was a block and a half from where I grew up. And my brother, who was the sound guy, was also a graduate of that high school. So I knew a lot of those people before the film started happening. But all of my co-producers and co-directors were white folks who were not from, my block. So I feel like the insider-outsider thing for me has always been coexistent. I've never just been an insider in any project. I feel a lot of my career has been like explaining my insiderness to my collaborators. And I think that a lot of it has to do with code switching. Like I fundamentally believe I'm actually not really an insider anywhere because I have left culturally in so many ways from where I'm from, even though I still live nearby. My family's also in the Bronx and all that stuff. But the ability to code switch as a communicator is, I think, what that really means. So that when I'm going to certain places, the people who I'm filming or spending time with, they don't have to explain themselves to me. Like I read the code, I speak that language. And that's kind of how that's worked for me. And I think I present as a certain way. So like the way I present is disarming, and I can like slang up my language, which is kind of how I talk anyway. But for me, the flip side of that code switching has to do with then who I'm working with, and then going farther is the world in which these films are being made. Like I've always had to explain something that other people don't understand. It just depends on kind of what level.
So just to challenge you, I mean, the traditional practice of the documentary is the generalist who can go anywhere, any country, culture, community, and make a film. They can do their research, they can get to know people to try to, gain their trust, and maybe hire fixers who are from inside those communities to help smooth the way. So is there, again, getting to Eddie's idea of what's in the DNA of the documentary, that what's in the soul of the documentary, where being an insider really makes a difference, and why couldn't somebody from the outside or a white filmmaker, just do the same thing, learn the codes, just do a little extra work to get inside these stories? Anybody?
I would say it's because we live ultimately in a white supremacist power structure. So you have the issue.
You were right there, huh? Didn't you?
Yeah.
It's all good.
Sorry. But actually I'm not sorry, it's true. But we live in a white supremacist power structure. So when you have, again, the traditional colonial white lens of documentary filmmaking and journalism, et cetera, and particularly if you're dealing with a Western culture, when sort of the outsider who has a different position of power and status goes into a community that is traditionally, that's not theirs, there's a different dynamic at play, as opposed to, as what Nadia and everyone else up here said, the idea of being someone who is maybe was at some point in their life, maybe as you said you've left, but was on equal footing with the people that they are exploring and the community that they're exploring. So I think it's for us about disrupting that white supremacist power structure and trying to change that dynamic. And I think we have to align ourselves again with other filmmakers across race and gender and all those sort of things to make that to make an impact.
I'd like to comment on that as well. The film I shot, Motherland, was shot in the Philippines, and I'm not Filipino, and I don't speak the language. Ramona Diaz, who's the director of the film, she is Filipino, and I think sort of when I watch that film, what I think sets the verite apart from some other films that I've seen that have been made by white filmmakers is that, you know, I'm half Puerto Rican, and I went and shot a film in a country that was also colonized by the Spanish. There's something about the way Filipino people look that is very, like, it was just very familiar to me. A lot of the women I filmed reminded me of girls that I went to high school with. Watching what was happening in that hospital, it wasn't interesting to watch. Like, when I watched the women, what I was looking at was coming from a place of love for something that was incredibly familiar. And I feel like that really comes across in the warmth and the quality of the footage in that film versus just being someone that is an observer, someone that does not feel comfortable in a space, is watching but staying far away. And sort of how a lot of, historically documentaries have been made by white people have had this sort of outsider or patronizing quality to them, and that white gaze is present in those films. And versus when the gaze is coming from someone who is not white, what does that film feel like? What's the quality in that film look like?
And I would just say, though, at the same time, it's it's kind of like how we respond in the face of trauma and unfolding conflict and the after effects of trauma. Because not that all documentaries should be social issues and such, implicate such heated issues, but I think, at the end of the day, like, race is this very sort of fabricated social construct, and it's based at best on soft science, like this idea that I'm Asian, like the categorization of what I could call myself within the Asian, check boxes on the census only gave me 6 options as of year 2000. And so it's these very murky lines of, like, otherness, I think, and inclusivity and outsiderness. And at the end of the day, I think it's really, when you see something really fucked up happening, how do you respond? Or it's something really heartbreaking, what is your human response to that? And I think, like, people of the culture can go in and make tons of terrible, like, anthropological mistakes, and a white person could go into the Philippines and do an excellent documentary. I think that it's a really, there's, for me, it comes down to a sort of a layer of respect and understanding of the culture, and that race and class are very complicated to talk about, and they overlap, as cleavages in a sense. You can't talk about one or the other without talking about the other, but culture is something that we can understand deeply, and sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. So
Yeah, what you two were saying made me think about this in a way that I haven't thought about before, which is, I wonder if part of it is this idea of safety. Like, when I'm making a film about people who look like me or kind of come from places where I'm from, I feel like there's certain safeties that I can't afford, right? I don't have the distance to feel like I'm making a film about something that's over here, and I'm on this perch where my particular individual experience sort of isn't affected by the happenings of the people that I'm making a film about. So I imagine if I was a woman, I was making a film about sexual assault, I would feel like there's an absence of that safety versus like a man doing it, where I don't have to face those things in certain ways. And I think there's lots of sort of intersections where that can be the case, and I feel like that brings kind of an urgency and anger and kind of an emotional timber to my work, which is like, I can't afford to detach. And I feel like maybe if if you're not from that particular universe, you can. Even if you don't want to, but the ultimate truth is you can't. You're not from there. You don't have relatives who are from there. You don't have relatives who, if they went there, they would be identified as those kinds of people. The cops won't look at you like they would look at someone else. And I feel like there's something behind. Like, I was thinking about what you were saying, Nadia. Like, where does that come from? That different lens, because it's not just an education thing. It's something that's like in your body, I feel.
Can I add one thing? I think, and just to echo what you said, I think you're absolutely right that we can't generalize about, like that people of color can go into spaces, where there are other people of color, and they won't necessarily make a better film. It doesn't mean that they're better filmmakers, or, but what I do think is it's about dismantling a systemic and structural white lens that Nadia was mentioning, wherein this sort of colonial attitude, this sort of that we have to really address, and we have to do as filmmakers, and it's work. I think this is work. It's work for men to be feminist. It is work for white folks to be anti-racist. There is sort of a level of there is like a process and I think that you have to go through to really understand your own perhaps sexism, your own racism, your own, and I think for people of color, there's colorism, there's class. We also have our own issues within our own communities that we have to really work on. So I think that's part of a necessary, sort of a necessary aspect that we have to all look at as we go into places as filmmakers, and because no matter what, once you pick up a camera, you're always a little bit of an outsider. You're automatically an outsider. You're separating yourself with the camera, right, as opposed to just being present and engaging as a human being. So I think that's important to note.
So that's really interesting. On the one hand, you've talked about the personal, and that if you have that personal investment where you've had to, let's say, look in the eyes of racism, or look straight in the eyes of homophobia, and because you embody that for people, you have that personal investment. On the other hand, you all seem to have like a kind of political analysis that goes beyond, oh, this is a terrible thing that happened to these victims, and let's make a film that exposes, let's say, what happened last year to teenagers of color, or to women in the Philippines who were denied let's say contraception or whatever, and you're looking at it, and in the conversation today about race and difference, people are going back to reconstruction and the roots of racism and reconstruction, and going back to the roots of racism and classism in colonization and imperialism. So it's pretty interesting stuff, I think, that really has moved in the past few years. So given that, when you've gone into, and Nadia, you talked about when you've gone into spaces as cinematographers, editors, or directors, where it's a completely new culture, new community to you, what's been your experience there? I mean, in Crime and Punishment, for example, you were filming in the Bronx and largely with African American and Latino communities. So how did you navigate that, and how did people respond to you, as opposed to like High Tech Low Life or the Stephen Kim film, where Stephen Kim, being also Korean American and having that instant kind of affinity?
Do you want to go first, or?
I think it was directed.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think it's really important to go in and actually be as dispassionate as possible when you're in the sort of footage gathering stage, and when you're investigating a story. I think to go in with sort of a preconceived notion about who you think the good guys and bad guys are, who your protagonists are. I mean, I hold a lot of sort of private skepticism, and I'm vetting and really overanalyzing as much as possible, because I think the worst thing we can do is like fit these very important stories into these propagandistic frameworks that the documentary world and market is yearning for and wants us to make. And the best thing we can do is create very complex narratives that actually don't really clearly define the right and wrong, but but look as objectively, as observationally as possible.
Well, how did you navigate the personal relationships with your subjects? Because there is a lot of anger in other communities of color about, this idea of Asians as this model minority, and they get a certain amount of racial privilege because of, the way they're looked upon, again, because of the model minority myth. Did you face that at all?
I mean, a long time ago, I thought that I was just going to make films about Asian people, and I found that, well, one, that's very limiting, but then two, also that, the same kind of empathy that you have learned by way of the struggles you experienced, as a minority, that arms you with a great deal. And then the fact that to just roll into a situation and to give a shit and to stay there for not just a few weeks or months, but years, and really listen, I mean, that cuts across everything. I mean, if you do that, you can tell any story anywhere, I think, if you really show you care and you have a deep commitment, and it doesn't matter who you are. But I think a lot of us are like on these very pressurized sort of broadcast schedules where let's try and turn something around in 9 or 12 months, and I don't think that's convincing to certain communities that are going through deep generations of trauma.
Nadia, did you have a comment?
I guess in speaking to going into spaces that are not directly connected to me culturally or otherwise, I've been very lucky. I've been shooting documentaries for 15 years, so I feel like I have been in just the spectrum of spaces and places and types of people that I've had the opportunity to film has just taught me so much about humanity and the world and people as well. And I think that people also, as much as we are sort of trying to figure them out and trying to tell their story, they're figuring us out as well. And there's something about our presence and how we treat them and we treat the people around us that has a huge effect and that crosses over any race or class or any type of situation. But I also find that I tend to become very protective of folks that I feel like I'm filming, and sometimes if I am filming with a white filmmaker or a filmmaker that may not necessarily understand the space that they're in, I do think I see things that they don't see oftentimes, especially if I'm staring at someone in this tiny viewfinder and I'm looking into their eyes for 10 hours a day. There are things that I'm gonna know about that person that the director just doesn't see because they're not as close. And so a lot of times it's just me trying to negotiate how I can communicate how I'm feeling about what's happening in the situation. And sometimes the situations, it's not every time you're in a space as a DP or editor or a person on a crew where you feel comfortable with what's happening around you. So, I do feel it's my duty because of where I come from in my experience that in many ways that I'm also sort of trying to protect and stick up for people that are being filmed that, in that situation, they just don't have as much power necessarily as the filmmaker.
Geeta or Edwin, do you have a comment?
I'm sorry, can you repeat? I was listening so hard to these guys.
I can. I have something I can go with. You were asking a question earlier, and I Geeta, I feel like there's a structural part of this that we could talk about, which is I think really valuable. Part of it is sort of the individual navigating of bicultural differences and how we present and who's making what. But I do feel, getting back to the DNA question, that there is something underneath it that is sort of bigger than all of us. And I was thinking today, as coming down here, this Western culture has historically, before film, has had traveling observers. It's a thing that has happened for centuries. And I feel like the question of why our culture, what role the traveling observer plays in our culture, is something that we have to really think about, and why we have this need for people to leave this culture and go into other cultures to do things, whatever it is that they do. Now it's documentarians, before it wasn't. and just that fundamental kind of pattern that we are behaving in, for me, is part of the DNA. And I think that, not that I'm saying that everything has to be changed or revolutionized, but just it's a question. It's like, why do we do that? And I think in that there's something to understand about the role that plays to kind of keep our status quo moving forward, and like how individually we're trying to disrupt that by making, films and rooms look browner and look more female and look different, but are we just repopulating the same kind of mechanism? And that's a question that I've been wrestling with for a while.
No, I think just to build off of what you're saying, I think I completely agree and understand that. Like again, and it gets back to the work, right, that we have to do. Like we don't necessarily, just because, we fill a room with, as he mentioned, with brown people who now are in these positions of having these jobs. It's really also about, it's not just about doing that and replicating the same system, the same colonial system. I think it really is about changing that system, dismantling it, right? We have to look at the way that it's done. And I think, access is obviously one of the first steps. It's very helpful to have access for us, to funding, to distribution, to all the ways that we need to make our films. But then it's critical that once we arrive there, and those of us who, some of us, there are some people who have arrived, there's people who are in those positions, to really look at changing the dynamic and the way that films are made, and questioning, and questioning the structure. I think that even for myself, like I make a point, and it's sort of a rule that I've made for myself, that if a film comes my way and it is a film that I feel that is, that there is someone else who can do it better, or someone who is from that community who could do it better, I pass it on. I don't take it. And I won't take it unless I have someone else on board who is an equal partner, from that community, or who is part of that story in a way that I am not. And I think that's something that, like for instance, we need to demand of essentially those who are already in those positions, perhaps, and then we have to live it ourselves. And it's interesting. On most of my films, I've had a co-director, and I've done that because I felt that it was critical to have someone else who gave different depth to it. And there's a lot of ego involved in that, which is really difficult, and you fight. But but the idea of, there's someone else here who brings authenticity to this and who can check me on my own nonsense, and vice versa. So I think there's sort of practices, I think, that we have to start working on. And it's a a longer process. Obviously, it's hard to dismantle and rebuild something, but I think it's doable.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to give that concrete kind of, I said at the beginning, the idea of documentary, I think, builds culture. We are not only documenting culture, and so a part of that is placing people in positions of power, of telling their own story, of shaping their own identity. So concretely, it does mean in a production, if you're a director, you're a producer, you're an editor, you're a camera person, you don't necessarily hire the fixer. My last film, No Más Bebés, was shot in East Los Angeles. My co-producer, Virginia Espino, grew up there. She's from that community. She knew that story. She's been a part of building Latino culture. So that was a very intentional kind of choice. So I wonder if any of the other panelists can talk about, what do you do concretely in terms of changing that paradigm, changing the way we make films?
I can jump in. Is that all right?
Sure.
For me, well, I'll say two things. Where I see this the most prevalently, this is where I'm at now. I'm finishing a personal statement with Julie Dressner, who's in the room, is in rough cut screenings, when we show our film to audience or feedback, and we get the most coded racist shit you can imagine. And it's happened with every film I've made. There's brown people. It's like, oh, you have to put in statistics at the beginning of the film, or you have to show the garbage on the streets in the Bronx, or you have to show how bad the school is and how horrible their lives are for their story to make any sense to us. And I think that's part of the role that I was talking about, is my role as a documentarian is being conceived in coded ways in those moments as reinforcing this like cultural otherness, you know, like, oh, my world makes sense because that world is terrible, and that's the only narrative I can understand. And so those are always really hilarious internal experiences for me when I'm just in the back and like, oh, here it goes again.
But
Like
do you think you have to be the culture police? Is that?
no, I mean, I mean, I think those people are just misguided, and I'm not trying to fix them. Like, I'm tired of fixing white people. Like, that's not my role anymore on Earth. But because it's not, it doesn't work, right? But what I can do is by using that as fuel to decode and make my work better, because those people do exist. To collaborate with white folks and other folks who aren't that way, right? And to build work together. But I feel like for me, the biggest thing that I've seen is like creating characters or communicating, not creating, communicating characters with who have narrative agency. And so it's not, they're not an exemplar of a idea. Like, oh, I want to fix poverty, so I'm going to show these people as exemplars, as like these talismans of how I, as a white filmmaker or any filmmaker, even a Puerto Rican filmmaker, wants to fix poverty. It's like that's kind of my agency, and they're becoming vessels for my agenda. But I think creating narrative agency, which is just like also just good storytelling, is for me one of the most concrete things that I've tried to do in telling stories, so that the characters are their own complete human beings who are going on some sort of journey. Now, I make character-based movies. You know, I don't make kind of issue films. So that's my concrete approach.
Any other comments to that? Steve? Look, spit it out.
So I walked out of this burrito shop once, and I was like mid-bite, and this soft top Suzu Amigo was tearing around the corner, and there were 4 Hispanic guys in it, and they go, "Hey, where's the kung fu fight, Jackie Chan?" And then I was like, "But I'm eating a burrito, and this is I don't know where the kung fu fight is." And I just thought this is the funniest sort of little racial moment here, where you know, whatever that meant, it was funny to me, and I felt like, oh, that could be a great little scene in a movie, because one would not know what to do with that. And I think like in the stories we tell, if we don't engage our audiences to do a little bit of work and be you know, be active participants in the story, then we're doing something wrong. And I think like character-driven stories are where we can build in the really most meaningful you know, murkiness, because I think there's so much pressure to create sort of cogent narrative stories, and that's not the way the world works. We don't, you know, we impose an intro and a conclusion, you know, a start and a finish to our stories, and that there's nothing real about that, you know. And so I think it's really important that we create, you know, that the films do have a very character-driven kind of foundation to it, and that it's human experiences that are open to interpretation sometimes.
But as storytellers, if you talk about, let's say, changing the paradigm, that single character's journey, that is kind of a central part of the Western narrative, where, you know, multiple characters, let's say. I mean, if you make a film about a movement or, you know, social issue, it's, you know, history is moved by many people pushing it forward. So in terms of storytelling itself, how do you flip that switch? How do you change that paradigm? Or is it even, you know, since we're operating in this market with this audience, do we just have to kind of go with that narrative structure and those narrative traditions?
I would say, I mean, I don't think so at all. I think you can defy them. You know, I think there is, for instance, there's films that are still incredibly successful, that do, you know, flip that narrative. There's also so many different kinds of films. There's archival films. There's, you know, there's films that are historical that, you know, again, may not be verite, you know, or be sort of based in, just have a different feel to them. Again, I think the connection to character is really important in general. Like a human connection really matters in storytelling. But there's obviously films about, you know, now about places as opposed to, you know, like it's, so I think that there's multiple ways of making your art, but I think the key thing that everyone mentioned is that we, when we're dealing with these communities, that we be very, very cognizant of that sort of traditional colonial lens, and we do everything we can to avoid it in the way that we depict our characters, that we tell the most complex stories possible, that we give our characters in the communities that we're dealing with the full treatment, that they would get otherwise. If it was, I always think, and I come from narrative originally, so I always think if this was a narrative scripted film that was, that I really want, that would really reach people, how complex and interesting would the characters be? They wouldn't just be obviously sort of there's so many stereotypes that have been put upon us as brown people, black folks, people of color, like the whole, as Asians. There's so and I think to defy each and every one of them is sort of the part of what we need to do. As filmmakers, as we put out our own work, we have to and again, sometimes there is some truth in the stereotypes, unfortunately, which you can't avoid. But I think the idea of treating, making sure that we sort of celebrate, that we portray the celebrations, the struggles, everything as fully as we should, and not just dwell in maybe the agenda. If there is a social issue agenda, like you mentioned, like poverty, that we have to elevate out of what is sort of expected of us and of our people.
Well, that's a great segue to, we have a very short amount of time for questions from the audience. So can we, I'll start from over there. You were way at the end, you had the first hand up. And yes, on the aisle seat.
Two very good and complicated questions. I think, yeah.
So she pointed out that when she's worked in Africa as a European filmmaker, that the gaze of the upper class Africans has been even sharper and more stratified than from the point of view, she would argue, as a European filmmaker. And her second question, part of her question was, I think that was the full question, right?
No, how do you define the black gaze?
Oh, how do you define the black gaze? Okay.
So I think when you see those types of power structures, you're thinking, so like in a place that has, been colonized, the gaze is from colonialism. So when I see it as the white gaze, and you're looking at sort of this social hierarchy, even within black communities, if you think about the roots of that, it's from colonialism. And that's still a white gaze, even if it's another person of color that has that sort of patronizing perspective of someone in their own community or with the same dark skin as them. Where did they learn that from? And that's sort of something that I think it's important for us to recognize. And so the black gaze, I guess, as you put it, I think, the white gaze is sort of this, again, looking at historically in America, I'm speaking of specifically, documentary films have been made by, white people that also come from a certain level of, they come from a place of resources because it costs a lot of money to make films. It's sort of probably within the last 10 years that the opportunity to make films has opened up a lot more to people of color. And so I think, you could look at, a photographer's work like Gordon Parks. That's a black gaze. I think that when someone has a very strong perspective and very strong love of a community, you can see that. And I'm not saying also that a white person, a white photographer, a white cinematographer, a white filmmaker also, like Steve said, cannot achieve a beautiful image of another person of color. But I think when we look at the texture of some of those images, we can see something different. And I think it's important to study it and see what that difference actually is. And you may not be able to articulate it in words, but there is sort of a texture, I think, to it that does exist.
Were you going to respond, Geeta?
No, I just wanted to add that obviously within, there's stratification within societies. For example, originally my family is from India, and within the Hindu community there is stratification because there was the caste system that originally existed, and upper caste Hindus will look down very much on, even though it was supposedly eradicated, that's not true. And there is, tremendous stratification. However, the idea, again, India too, it was the concept of the white gaze, just to sort of back what Nadia was saying, it really comes from the idea of colonization, and global domination based on white supremacy and oftentimes Christianity. So there's this link. Basically, there are no, like, Africans did not go out and colonize Europe, right? It's the reverse. So Europeans went out and colonized the majority of the world, and still on a global level hold power. So it's that systemic and structural power structure, that really that informs everything. That informs our media. That informs our finances, right? It's like and what Nadia said is absolutely true. It takes a lot of money, and it's a privilege to be able to make films. And it's why you see less people of color in the industry. We were also not allowed to make films, but that's part of it as well.
First of all, I've had a question that I've been asking for a long time. It's fascinating. You can analyze every film according to this question. Who is telling whose story, to whom, using whose storytelling methods, and why? I challenge us all to subject all of our films to that question.
I would also abstain for it.
Oh, yeah. Fair enough. And my question for the panel is, I think for many of us who are people of color, we ourselves have experienced internalized colonization and internalized racism. And so the stories we even think to tell may well be very different. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking while you both were talking. I mean, the article that I wrote, which was in reflection to a film called City of Trees, which is about an organization working in a neighborhood that wasn't theirs to kind of, improve the parks in the neighborhood. I walked into South Ward 8 in DC, Southeast DC, feeling like, oh, I'm like a down brown person. I grew up really poor in the hood in the Bronx, and so I'm gonna walk into DC and like know what's what. And then realizing that was a total mythology that I had, bought myself into. And I think where the kind of both of these things can feel really daunting. The bigness of the structural analysis and the pervasiveness of the individual identity politics inequality, like the twain meet in self-reflection, right? The way that we, all of us, because it's not just like brown folks can't fix racism. That's a white problem. Like, white people started racism, so it's up to you guys to fix that. And we can do it in collaboration, right? And so, but how we internalize, how I internalize, I mean, I'm Puerto Rican, we are still colonized. I mean, if you've read the news, it's really fucked up right there. And so, but how I've as an individual have internalized these lessons through my entire life, like that's the DNA in me too. And I think that leads me to, make certain choices that are like colonial choices in my career, which I'm wrestling with these months, these weeks now. It's not like I'm in some woke place in my life. It's a daily battle, and it's a daily struggle. And I feel like all of us have to understand with the fabric that we're in and seeing the wallpaper of the room that we may have ignored. And the tricky thing is when we have the privilege to ignore it, those are the times when I think it's most important for people to step out of their privileged space and say, oh, I don't have to look at that wallpaper, but I'm going to. And as a man, that's something that I've been working really hard on trying to do is I don't have to look at this, but I'm going to, because it's going to enrich all of like the entire fabric of my existence by stepping out of that. And so, yeah, it's super, super hard, but that's where the work is.
I'm afraid on that note,
no.
I know
We
we could go, but the great thing is that we have a reception upstairs, and we can all keep talking. So I'm so sorry that I have to cut them off, but we have another film in here, and I'm so sorry.
you.
I want to thank all our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Geeta, Eddie, and Nadia. Thank you so much, and please, you're all invited to join us upstairs for the reception with ADOC and Ford Foundation.